peasants sitting around it, relaxing, pondering the day. It's just absolutely beautiful.
And that fascination with objects is very much your book. When did the West fascination with Asia begin?
I think probably we were saying earlier on, weren't we, back to perhaps the 5th century BCE, these crazy stories coming in from India, often sort of second-hand via Persian sources. So it's quite hard to know what turned out to be elephants and parrots, whether those things would really exist or not. So you've got those stories coming in. You've also got spices coming in from India and elsewhere, big part of the Roman diet, particularly pepper. You can see various Roman social critics getting upset. People are spending too much money on pepper. It suggests that society is imminently collapsing. I think also silk as well, although people didn't know in, for example, ancient Roman era much or really anything reliable about China. Still, the fact that silk is coming in alongside spices, there's some theme there really early on that suggests a danger to the Western world of some of these luxuries coming in and people wasting all their money on them.
Critical to understanding what was going on was the work the Jesuits were doing. So talk to me about, because this idea of conversion wasn't always what people were doing. People were also saying, well, look, this is an interesting religion, we might appropriate from that, but we're not desperately going to try and mission them, as it were. But at first, the Jesuits weren't about conversion, they were about understanding.
I think they were about understanding as a means to conversion.
Yeah.
So if we sort of fast forward to the 1500s, when they are effectively using Portuguese merchant vessels as a kind of global taxi service, getting out to places like India, China and Japan, I think they were hoping that if you can really understand elite culture, make some conversions at that level, you'll have a kind of trickle-down effect. And it goes fabulously wrong early on. The Jesuits in Japan turn up to meetings with these great feudal lords wearing sackcloth.
Yeah, they think that's what you do.
Well, exactly. If you're back in Europe, that's a sign that you've given up the world, that you're pious people. In Japan, that's just not how you dress for a meeting. It's a sign of extraordinary disrespect. So Jesuits had to learn to use chopsticks and do the tea ceremony, build their houses in the right way. Crucially, not have livestock in your house anymore. As the feudal lords tell the Jesuits, anyone seeking or preaching great wisdom won't stink and won't live with animals. If you want to be taken seriously, you have to understand these local cultures, and that's how you begin to get, I think, a European understanding of Japanese language, Chinese, also Sanskrit, because they need to immerse themselves in this culture and these cultures to some extent. A lot of that comes flooding back to Europe, and you have, for example, in the 18th century, a wonderful China boom almost out of nowhere as a result.
But on that question of whether or not the information they were gathering was for the greater good or because they had their own motivations, this idea of West was best was really there before Victorian times. It was early because, of course, it was about, you know, Christianity is best. We will appropriate some actions from Buddhism, for example, but we're better.
I think early on, a lot of the Jesuits would have compared parts of Indian and Chinese culture to Lutheranism back at home, which was, it was in some sense demonically inspired. But at the same time, people discovering, for example, Confucius, Jesuits were really impressed, because here was a system of ethics where it isn't about doing good so that you don't get spanked in the afterlife. It's actually because it's a good thing to do on earth here and now. And some of those Jesuits would compare Confucian ethics with the very best of ancient Rome. So these are advanced cultures which just now need the gospel to take them that final step.
But just like from the early sale, that whole idea of trade was massive, wasn't it? Because when China and Japan opened up, then you get this great decoration, and you know it's very sought after in the West.
You have this lovely period, I think, in the second half of the 18th century, where, of course, tea comes in, but that's British quite quickly. That really gets appropriated as British. But you have this beautiful Chinese wallpaper, for example. So if you have a country home of a certain size and you've got a musty old tapestry on the wall and you want to replace it with something a bit cheerful, this beautiful wallpaper, off-white background, you've got birds perched on branches, people in Chinese dress going about what Europeans imagined was Chinese business. Funnily enough, in China, very few people would have had that kind of stuff on their walls. Instead, it was really all about plain walls, kind of demure decor. And these things were kind of being knocked off in places like Canton, block printed rather than handcrafted, which is what the people back in Europe hoped might be the case. But you've got wonderful lengths people go to if you've got a bit of outdoor space. People build a pavilion, the Chinese pavilion in their garden, or a lovely arched bridge. Someone even adopts a Chinese child for a while. So it's a real...
Well, that is a bit exoticism,
yes,
isn't it?
which miraculously fades away almost as quickly as it begins.
But let's look at what was coming the other way and highlight people who were travelling to the West, like Swami Vivekananda.
So once you get, I think, into the late 19th century, the balance starts to shift because for centuries and centuries, Europeans finding out about Asia have gone there literally or imaginatively, chosen what they find interesting and brought it back. Swami Vivekananda, a guru, reformer, social activist from Calcutta, actually makes the journey to Britain, tours around the United States, maybe one of the first to teach yoga actually in the Western world, and he's giving his own take on Asian wisdom on his own terms. And he makes this argument that becomes quite popular, I think, in the 20th century, which is, yes, the West have all these wonderful achievements in terms of the sciences, technology, etc. All that has been purchased, he would say, at the cost of the Western soul. You have a really good knowledge about the world from a distance point of view, but that sense of knowledge of the world, participation in it, being at home in it, you've lost, he would say, and that's what he can offer.
It is interesting though, because of course Americans seen as a kind of broadly a pretty religious country, and yet what he brings is a spirituality that the Americans haven't had before.
I think that's right. And when he speaks, for example, there's a World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, there are some embarrassing moments because you have people from all around the world, as it were, pitching their faiths. When people like
pitching their faiths.
Yeah, it's a kind of, it really is a kind of pick and mix sort of approach. And when someone like Swami Vivekananda speaks and then sits down and finishes, the hall resonates to the sound of chairs being pushed back. People are leaving because they don't want to hear from whoever's up for Christianity next, because they're looking for something new. Whether it's a sense of a slight loss of faith, perhaps, or a disenchantment, perhaps with American culture more broadly, that's clearly what they're after. And Swami Vivekananda is very good, as our counterparts in Japan, at picking up on that and kind of producing export versions of their traditions that will play well in places like America.
And then we've got a figure of Alan Bates, who actually goes right through his journey goes right through to the Beat Generation and to living in San Francisco in the early 60s.
Yes, Alan Watts.
Alan Bates, sorry, Alan Watts.
Alan Watts, that's right, yes. I think he's quite well known as a counterculture guru figure, pictured often with this long, straggly hair, goatee beard, and a Japanese kimono, and maybe a glass of vodka in one hand. So a controversial figure in all sorts of ways. But I think he's important because he speaks to a sense in the middle of the 20th century that, for whatever reason, Christianity leaves people feeling cold. In his case, left him feeling quite lonely. As a child, he was afraid to go to sleep in case he died and ended up in the weird Christian heaven that was being pitched to him at church. And it wasn't until he was rifling around in Camden Market, finding books on yoga and Buddhism, and starting to practice for himself, that he began to feel at home in the world again. He said lots of people in the West are suffering from a case of mistaken identity, and these practices can bring you home.
So, introducing mysticism to our more austere culture here, Joe, that whole idea, this is a very short period compared to what you're writing about, but it shows that exchange of ideas.
Oh, extraordinarily. That really, it comes into such a kind of density after about 1500, once people can get this global taxi service with the Portuguese and so on. But I think even before that, there are these connections that really go very long distances and are very much valued at both ends, or certainly in the West, that are in a way quite similar, that same kind of fascination, that same sense of giving us something that we're lacking in our own worlds that we can learn from, but that we always want to twist a bit to our own, we always want to add the glass of vodka.
and you've got, as I said, you've got a kind of call to arms then, that we have to have a reset. And why do we have to have this reset, do you think?
Well, I think history is more true, but also so much more interesting without the idea of civilizations. If we think in terms of connections, we think about our future history, the history we are creating right now for future generations, If we can focus on the connections we have with each other, not on individual nations, civilizations, heritage, roots, but on the actual world we are creating together still now, then we have some hope of survival.
And in terms of very quickly, for you, Carolina, on the exhibition, what's the ultimate thing that you want people to take away apart from Nick Combs?
Well, I guess along with the Nick Combs, it's that kind of reality of being a Roman soldier. But it goes a little bit with what Joe was saying now, that this idea of the Roman army as a single entity that functioned all in the same way, that it's not really the reality, because history is populated by individuals, and that bringing those individual stories gives you a much better sense of what was going on and what that reality was. Than just understanding the kind of monolith of the Roman war machine, if that makes sense. And I hope that's one of the main things in engaging with objects that are both grand and sort of mundane. I hope that's what people get.
Thank you very much to all my guests. Christopher Harding's The Light of Asia, The History of Western Fascination is out now. Josephine Quinn's How the World Made the West is published at the end of this month. And you can see Legion, Life in the Roman Army, co-curated by Carolina Rangel de Lima at the British Museum until the 23rd of June. Many thanks to today's studio engineer, Duncan Hannant. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe looks at whether the arts have the power to change the world. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Start the Week was presented by Kirsty Walk and produced by Katie Hickman.
Young Again with Kirsty Young.
The aim with Young Again is reflection, is people looking back at their lives and thinking about what they would have done differently.
You think you're on one path in life, and sometimes you find out you need to pivot.
It's our mistakes that we learn from. It's not the good bits and the easy bits, it's the difficult bits. However high people fly, that feeling is pretty universal.
Carrying that shame worked out okay.
We'll hear from Melinda French Gates, Grayson Perry, and Peter Capaldi.
And I haven't got a job, and I've got a family. How does this all work now?
Join me, Kirsty Young, for a new series of Young Again, starting tomorrow morning at 11 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
Now on Radio 4, our new Book of the Week. John Valiant's book tells the story of the super fire that engulfed Fort McMurray in Canada in May 2016. It's read by Kerry Shale.
On a hot afternoon in May 2016, 5 miles outside the young petro city of Fort McMurray, Alberta, a small wildfire flickered and ventilated, rapidly expanding its territory through a mixed forest that hadn't seen fire in decades. This fire had started out doing what most human-caused wildfires do in their first hours of life, working its way tentatively through grass and dead leaves, a fire's equivalent to baby food. These fuels, in combination with the weather, would determine what kind of fire this was going to be. A creeping ground-level smolder doomed to smother in the heavy dew of a cool and windless spring night, or something bigger, more durable and dynamic, a fire that could turn night into day and day into night, that could, unchecked and all-consuming, bend the world to its will. It was early in the season for wildfires. The first responders were shocked by what they saw. By the time a helicopter with a water bucket got over it, the smoke was already black and seething, a sign of unusual intensity. The fire grew from 4 acres to 150 in 2 hours. Its rapid growth coincided with a rash of broken temperature records across the North American subarctic that peaked at 33 degrees Celsius on May 3rd, in a place where temperatures are typically between 15 and 20 Celsius. Then, a smoke and wind-suppressing inversion lifted. Winds whipped up to 20 knots, and a monster leaped across the Athabasca River. Within hours, Fort McMurray was overtaken by a regional apocalypse that drove serial firestorms through the city from end to end for days. Entire neighborhoods burned to their foundations beneath a towering pyrocumulus cloud typically found over erupting volcanoes. This fire-driven weather system generated hurricane-force winds and lightning that ignited still more fires many miles away. Nearly 100,000 people were forced to flee a suddenly annihilating world where fists of heat pounded on windows and the sky rained fire. The fire's toll conjured images of a nuclear blast. There was not just damage, there was total obliteration. It had belched 100 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, much of it from burning cars and houses. And it burned for months, not declared fully extinguished until August the following year. Wildfires live and die by the weather, but the weather doesn't mean the same thing it did in 1990, or even a decade ago. And the reason the Fort McMurray fire drew international attention was not only because of its size and ferocity, but also because it was a direct hit on the epicenter of Canada's multi-billion-dollar petroleum industry. That industry and this fire represent supercharged expressions of two trends that have been marching in lockstep for the past century and a half. Together, they embody the spiraling synergy between the headlong rush to exploit hydrocarbons at all costs and the corresponding increase in heat-trapping greenhouse gases that is altering our atmosphere in real time. In the spring of 2016, the hottest year in recorded history, a new kind of fire introduced itself to the world. "No one's ever seen anything like this," said Fort McMurray's exhausted fire chief. "The way this thing happened, the way it traveled, the way it behaved. This is rewriting the book." Canada contains 10% of the world's forests, vast tracts of which are uninhabited. But vast is an ineffective descriptor up here, in the landlocked subarctic. Things seem to occur in outsized dimensions. Lakes can be the size of inland seas, with trout which can weigh 45 kilograms. In Wood Buffalo National Park is the world's largest known beaver dam. Spotted in 2007 with the aid of a satellite, it's more than twice as long as the Hoover Dam, and it appears to be growing. One exception to this are the trees, which seldom exceed 60 feet in height or 100 years in age. These woods of pine, spruce, aspen, poplar, and birch are known as the boreal forest. Girdling the northern hemisphere in a circumpolar band, it is the largest terrestrial ecosystem, comprising almost a third of the planet's total forest area. As densely wooded as the boreal might appear, it is something far more amphibious, containing more sources of fresh water than any other biome. It resembles a kind of hemispheric sponge that happens to be covered in trees, their billions of miles of roots weaving the continents together in a subterranean warp and weft. In spite of all that water, these trees are designed to burn down on a regular basis. The circumboreal is truly a phoenix among ecosystems. Reborn in fire, it must incinerate in order to regenerate, and it does so in its random patchwork fashion every 50 to 100 years. This colossal biome stores as much, if not more, carbon than all tropical forests combined, and when it burns, it goes off like a carbon bomb. Fort McMurray is an anomaly in North America. Located 600 miles south of the Arctic Circle, the city is an island of industry in an ocean of trees. Without the lure of petroleum, this part of Alberta would resemble Siberia even more than it already does. But in 2016, Fort McMurray and its satellite communities were home to an international population of nearly 90,000 people, living in buildings ranging from trailer homes to McMansions and high-rise concrete apartments. Canada is the world's fourth largest oil producer, and almost 90% originates in Fort McMurray. In terms of overtime logged and dollars earned, it is without a doubt the hardest working, highest paid municipality on the continent. Fort McMurray has earned several nicknames, and one of them is Fort McMoney. May 3rd, 2016 began differently for everyone, but in Fort McMurray, it ended the same. Certainly, it was a little early for fires. There were still car-sized blocks of ice on the riverbanks, and some lakes had yet to thaw, but otherwise this was nothing new. Fires cloud the horizon every spring and summer. Smoke is simply a feature of the boreal landscape. But in the forest, out of sight, things were changing. Winter snowfall had been far below average 2 years running, and leaves crackled underfoot as if it were late summer. Given the unseasonable heat, and the fact that 5 separate wildfires ignited around the city that weekend, it's hard to overstate how unconcerned Fort McMurray's citizenry was. Fort McMurray is a one-industry town. That industry revolves around bitumen, its recovery, upgrading, and transport. A bitumen mine is not a place you would let your child play, but it's excavated using equipment familiar to any 4-year-old conversant in Tonka technology, and with a similar grandiosity of ambition. To access the bitumen, the forest above it must first be removed. This living material is referred to as overburden, and the machine used to scrape it off is a Caterpillar D11 bulldozer. This weighs more than 100 tons, and its blade is 22 feet wide. It plows down a forest like mowing a lawn. Once the forest has been removed, enormous electric shovels excavate the bituminous sand in boulder-sized chunks that occasionally contain complete dinosaur fossils from the Cretaceous period. These garage-sized loads are dumped into a Caterpillar T797 hauler, which is 3 stories tall and weighs 400 tons, unloaded. There are hundreds of machines like this operating in the mines north of Fort McMurray. Far too large for ordinary highways, the tires alone are 13 feet tall and cost $85,000 apiece. When one of them catches on fire, something that happens more often than one might expect due to the terrific friction their loads generate, it must be deflated from a safe distance with a rifle bullet. Should one of these 6-ton tires explode on its own, it will impact its surroundings like a powerful bomb. The hauler's job is to carry the raw bituminous sand over to the crusher, a kind of mechanical black hole with 2 gigantic, continuously turning studded cylinders, which, one employee told me, can consume a city bus in 3 seconds. The environment these behemoths are currently dismantling is an icebound netherworld. Mile upon mile of black and ransacked earth, pocked with stadium-swallowing pits, dead, discolored lakes, flaming stacks, and fuming refineries. The whole laced together by mazes of dirt roads and piping, patrolled by building-sized machines that, enormous as they are, appear dwarfed by the wastelands they have made. There's no place for the toxic effluent to go except into the soil or the air, or, if one of the massive earthen dams should fail, into the Athabasca River. For decades, cancer rates have been abnormally high in the downstream communities. Even people gainfully employed in the mines compare them to Mordor, like an ancient temple complex, bright